Hi guys, so we're going to first start off and talk about action potentials and why they're really important. In order to understand that, we need to understand a few basic concepts. What's the purpose of an action potential, right? And we're going to talk about whether or not an action potential will occur depending on the situation. And what that situation is, we're going to talk about right now. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is what is an action potential? Let's look at this nerve cell here, also called a neuron, and we're going to assume that this here is a motor neuron. In other words, I want to send a action potential, aka a signal. So I want to send an action potential in this direction, right? Maybe I'm trying to send a signal to trigger some type of muscle contraction so I can lift something off a table, or I can activate another neuron that is downstream. If we look at this part in green, right, this is the part where the action potential actually propagates. In other words, it's going to start off at the beginning of this axon right over here in a region called the axon hillock. So this whole long component that I'm going to highlight to you in purple here is the axon. There's the head part of the axon called the hillock, and the end part of the axon called the axon terminal. And terminal means end. And another name for action potentials, which you've probably heard of, are either signals or impulses. Right? And we're going to talk about what that purpose is. In order to understand action potentials, I do have to get you familiarized with two types of channels. In other words, if you look at the cell right over here, this is a nerve cell right over here. If we were to zoom in to this part of the nerve cell, right, let me just give you a different color. Let's do it in brown. If I were to zoom into this region, right, we're going to say that this here is the inside of the cell. This here is the inside of the cell, right? This here is the outside of the cell. And a few other things I do need to tell you is that we do have channels on this part of the cell. And these channels, let me just make it look a little better. Can actually open up if they bind to a chemical. In other words, here's a little animation here. So if this channel were to bind to a chemical, also called a ligand, same thing, same difference, this ligand can cause the opening of this channel. And now the channel opens up. Right? And in fact, if this here is what you call a sodium channel, and this channel were to open up, only sodium can go in or out of that cell. But one other thing I didn't tell you before, which I'll tell you now, is that if you look at the cell, the extracellular concentration of sodium is much higher than the intracellular concentration of sodium. In other words, there's so much more sodium on the outside of the cell relative to the inside of the cell. And naturally, if I were to open up this channel here, based on from this ligand that binds to it, based on its concentration gradient, sodium will naturally flow right into a cell. Right? Yes, there's also charge gradient, but I'm kind of going to neglect that right at this moment to oversimplify this for you. channels are typically specific. In other words, if it's a sodium channel, only sodium can go in or out of this channel, right? If it's a potassium channel, only potassium go in or out of this channel. A few other things I want to tell you is that chloride is also high typically on the outside of the cell relative to the inside of the cell. In fact, sodium and chloride typically hang out close together. Potassium is much higher on the inside of the cell relative to the outside of the cell. And let me just give you a different color just so we can, I love to color code this. So if I were to actually open up a potassium channel, potassium would naturally want to flow out because there's a higher concentration of potassium on the inside of the cell relative to the outside of the cell. Another thing I do want to go over is that if you look at this cell, not only do channels open up when chemicals bind to it, but there are also what you call voltage-gated channels. So if I were to zoom into this region right over here by the axon hillock, right over here, there are actually other channels called voltage-gated sodium channels. And what do you think voltage-gated sodium channels are? So I'm just going to call this a voltage-gated sodium channel. Voltage-gated sodium channels open up when the region of the cell hits a certain charge. In other words, if I'm going to zoom into this region right over here now, right, and I'm just going to go like this, right, and this here would be the axon hillock right over here. This would be the inside of the cell. This would be the outside of the cell. And I told you before, I'm just going to redraw this voltage-gated sodium channel. Notice I'm putting V for voltage. And these channels actually don't open with ligands because they're called voltage-gated sodium channels. So the inside of this charge here has to actually be a certain charge to cause this channel here to actually open up. And that charge is actually something called negative 55 millivolts. In other words, if we get the charge in this region low enough to negative 55 millivolts, these channels, which are voltage-gated sodium channels, will open.